Imagine the biting cold of a late autumn morning, not in a battlefield trench, but on your own front porch. You wake not to the smell of coffee, but to the scent of wood smoke and terror. The faces staring back at you are not neighbors, but soldiers, thousands of them, federal and state militia, marching into your peaceful valley, into your farm, into your life. They give you mere moments, moments to grab whatever you can carry. The clock is ticking, but the time is irrelevant because you are about to lose everything. Your grandfather's grave, the creek where your children learned to swim, the log cabin you built with your own hands, all of it is now confiscated, forfeit, stolen. The soldiers pride you forward with bayonets, pushing you into a column of hundreds, then thousands of fellow citizens. You don't know where you are going, but you know you are leaving your home forever. You look back one last time, and that is the moment history records your suffering. This is not fiction. This is the truth of the Trail of Tears. Welcome to TSF History, where we excavate the uncomfortable, unvarnished truths buried beneath the polished monuments of the past. Today, we plunge into one of the darkest, most profound betrayals in American history, the forced removal of the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muscogee, Creek, and Seminole Nations from their ancestral lands in the Southeast. This is a story of greed, broken promises, political ambition, and genocide, a journey that redefined American identity and sovereignty forever. Prepare yourself, because the real history is far more brutal than the simplified chapters in a textbook. To understand the tragedy, you first have to understand who the Cherokee and their neighbors were. We often see them portrayed in historical media as primitive, as uncivilized impediments to progress. The truth, however, is precisely the opposite. By the 1820s, the Cherokee Nation was, by all metrics, a functioning, modern, sovereign republic, and they had consciously adopted elements of European American culture to survive. They were, in fact, recognized by the federal government as one of the 5 civilized tribes. They weren't just farmers, they were plantation owners, mill operators, and merchants. They lived in established towns, wore clothing similar to their white neighbors, and many spoke fluent English. Critically, the Cherokee had a written language, thanks to the genius of Sequoyah, who perfected a sophisticated syllabary in 1821, leading to widespread literacy. They printed a bilingual newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix. In 1827, they drafted a formal constitution modeled after the U.S. Constitution, complete with an executive, legislative, and judicial branch. This was not a loose confederation of tribes. This was a well-organized, sovereign state, recognized by treaties signed with the U.S. government as far back as 1791, treaties that guaranteed their boundaries. But these very successes, their assimilation, their wealth, their fertile land, became their death warrant. The land they owned, stretching across what is now Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina, and Tennessee, was some of the most desirable agricultural territory in the world, perfect for growing cotton. And the relentless pressure from encroaching white settlers who saw the Cherokee as nothing more than a barrier to be removed began to boil over. The simmering conflict exploded in 1828 with 2 events. First, the discovery of gold near Dahlonega, Georgia, directly within Cherokee territory. This was not a small find. This was a gold rush, the first one in American history. It unleashed a torrent of lawless settlers who immediately started petitioning the state and federal government to remove the Cherokee. Second, the election of Andrew Jackson as president in 1828. Jackson, a celebrated war hero, but also a ruthless expansionist, was notorious for his deep-seated anti-Native American views and his history of fighting the Creek and Seminole people. His rise to power signaled a catastrophic shift in federal policy. The state of Georgia, emboldened by Jackson's election, passed a series of draconian laws. These laws declared the Cherokee Constitution null and void, annexed their lands, and prohibited the Cherokee from testifying in court against the white man. effectively making them non-citizens without legal rights on their own territory. The crisis reached its peak in 1830, when President Jackson, prioritizing expansion over constitutional obligation, pushed the Indian Removal Act through Congress. It passed by the narrowest of margins, essentially granting the president the authority to negotiate land exchange treaties with the nations east of the Mississippi, meaning forcing them to move west. This was a clear violation of previous treaties and the sovereignty of the nations involved. Jackson made his stance explicit, stating that removal was the only way to save the Native American people from annihilation. But his actions were clearly driven by the desire for land and political popularity in the South. The Cherokee did not submit quietly. They decided to fight back using the U.S. legal system they had studied and adapted. Led by their principal chief, John Ross, a man of mixed Scots and Cherokee ancestry who possessed unmatched political acumen, they took their case all the way to the Supreme Court. In 1831, in the case of Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, Chief Justice Marshall delivered a nuanced ruling declaring the Cherokee Nation a domestic dependent nation. This ambiguous status meant the Supreme Court could not rule on the case as if they were a foreign country, but it affirmed they were a nation nonetheless, not merely inhabitants of Georgia. The true victory came in 1832 with Worcester versus Georgia. The court ruled definitively that the state of Georgia had no right to impose its laws on the Cherokee Nation. Marshall's opinion was unequivocal. The Cherokee Nation was a distinct community, occupying its own territory, and within its borders, the laws of Georgia could have no force. This was a monumental legal win. The highest court in the land upheld Cherokee's sovereignty and condemned Georgia's actions. But legal victories mean nothing without enforcement, and this is where the betrayal of the American system became absolute. President Jackson famously ignored the ruling, allegedly stating, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Jackson's defiance of the Supreme Court was unprecedented, a clear abuse of executive power driven by racism and the insatiable hunger for cottonland. The federal government, under the guise of democracy, was now actively siding with state-sanctioned theft. While Chief John Ross and the majority of the Cherokee Nation continued their legal and political resistance, a small, splintered faction emerged. This group, led by men like Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, believed resistance was futile and moving west was the only way to avoid utter destruction. They were known as the Treaty Party. In 1835, this minority group traveled to Newachota, Georgia, and signed a treaty with U.S. government commissioners, a treaty that the vast majority of the Cherokee people vehemently opposed. The Treaty of Newachota ceded all remaining Cherokee land east of the Mississippi in exchange for $5 million and land in the west. This treaty was a fraud. It was signed by less than 2% of the Cherokee people, none of whom held the authority to represent the nation. Chief John Ross gathered over 15,000 signatures on a petition protesting the treaty, more signatures than Jackson had received in the election of 1832. But the Senate ratified the treaty by a single vote in 1836. The terms stipulated that the Cherokee had 2 years to voluntarily leave their homes and move west. The date was set for May 1838. The 2-year deadline passed. The majority of the Cherokee, still led by John Ross, refused to budge, convinced the U.S. government would not dare execute the fraudulent treaty. They were devastatingly wrong. In May 1838, President Van Buren, Jackson's successor, ordered the removal to begin. General Wincott Scott was put in charge of 7,000 U.S. Army troops and state militia. The operation was swift, brutal, and shocking. The soldiers systematically descended upon the Cherokee towns and farms. Families were ripped from dinner tables, children were snatched from play, and the elderly were hauled from their beds. They were not given time to gather supplies. Looters, following immediately behind the troops, stripped the homes clean, burning what they couldn't take. The Cherokee people were first placed into vast, poorly maintained, disease-ridden internment camps or stockades in the oppressive summer heat. When the official journey began, it was done mostly in forced marches. Approximately 16,000 Cherokee people were forced to walk over 1,200 miles across 9 states, from Georgia, across Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas to Oklahoma. The conditions were apocalyptic. The removal occurred primarily in the fall and winter of 1838 through 1839. They faced blizzards, freezing rain, and bitter cold, traveling without adequate clothing, shelter, or food. Disease, particularly typhus, dysentery, cholera, and whooping cough, swept through the columns, often killing the youngest and oldest first. They were forced to bury their dead along the route, a continuous line of hastily dug graves marking their passage. The most conservative estimates place the death toll at 4,000
Cherokee people, 1/4 of the entire nation, perishing during the removal and confinement. The tragedy earned its chilling name from the survivors themselves, the Trail of Tears, Nunodo Sunye, or the Trail Where They Cried. Other removed nations, like the Choctaw and Creek, experienced equally horrifying losses. It was an atrocity watched by the American public. Even some white Americans, including famed missionary Daniel Buttrick, documented the horrors, but the cries of the suffering were drowned out by the roar of expansion. The survivors arrived in what is now Oklahoma, a land that was largely unfamiliar and often hostile. They immediately began the arduous task of rebuilding their nation, recreating their government, schools, and infrastructure from the ruins of their journey. The political wounds of the removal never healed. The leaders of the Treaty Party, Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, who signed the fraudulent document, were assassinated in 1839 under a provision of Cherokee law that mandated death for anyone who sold national land without the consent of the people. This act of internal justice underscores the depth of the betrayal and the violence it spawned. The Trail of Tears is not just a chapter in the history of indigenous people. It is a foundational event in American history. It showcased that the U.S. government, driven by settler desires, was capable of tearing up its most sacred documents, its treaties, and its Supreme Court rulings to achieve its economic goals. It set a precedent of forced displacement that would continue across the continent for the next century. It is the blood-soaked price of the fertile fields of the American South. The people, however, endured. Today, the Cherokee Nation is the largest of the federally recognized tribes in the United States, a testament to the resilience, determination, and unyielding spirit of a people who survived unimaginable darkness. They rebuilt their sovereignty, their culture, and their economy, never forgetting the thousands of lives lost on that dark, forced march. The Trail of Tears leaves us with an inescapable question. What is the true cost of a nation's manifest destiny? Was the vision of a sprawling republic worth the mass graves that lined the frozen roads of that infamous trail? History is not just a ledger of accomplishments, it is a record of choices. And this choice, driven by the lure of gold and cotton, remains an indelible stain on the American soul. We must look at the empty chairs left by the 4,000 lost, not just the farms they left behind. Only then can we truly understand the depth of this betrayal. If this story shook you, if it informed you, and if it made you think about the true price of history, please let us know. Like this video if you believe these stories must be told and remembered. Comment below, what part of this history surprised you the most, and what other uncomfortable truths should TSF History explore next? And most importantly, subscribe to TSF History and hit the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the moments that shaped our world. Reflect on this journey and carry the memory of the lost with you. Until next time.